In 1981, on the eastern tip of Long Island, the United States government closed a military base, and as it shut the place down, it did something to the tunnels underneath that base no one can still understand. It did not fill them in with dirt. It did not knock the structures down and bury the rubble, the way you clear any old, dangerous abandoned site. It poured concrete into the passages. It welded the doors shut. It sealed the tunnels, deliberately, permanently. And in all the years since, through every records request and every official history and every survey of the land above it, no one has ever said what was below. And you have to ask why. Why go to all that trouble? Why pour concrete into a hole in the ground and weld the doors shut over an empty base no one was ever going to use again? Because the more you look, the more turns up, and all of it points the same direction. That the site hides something the public has never been told, even now, even after all these years. Documents have surfaced. Documents describing experiments that sound like something out of a fever dream, the kind of things you would swear no agency would ever actually attempt. Mind control, time portals, the strangest work the human imagination has ever put down on paper. And according to the paper, somebody tried it here. They closed Camp Hero in 1981 and sealed the tunnels beneath it with concrete, and no one will say what was down there. And tonight, I am going to walk you all the way up to that question, as far as the documents will let us go, and then I'm going to show you the concrete they poured to keep us from going any further. You can see the place from a long way off. There is a tower of steel out there that has been pointing at an empty sky for more than 40 years, standing about 90 feet tall, with a dish bolted to the top of it, roughly 40 feet across. A flat grey rectangle of riveted plate that looks less like a radar and more like a billboard with nothing written on it. It sits on the highest ground in the area, above the bluffs, above the scrub oak, visible from almost every trail. People drive out to the very end of the island to see the lighthouse, and then they look inland and see this thing rising over the tree line, and they slow down because it does not belong to anything anymore. It is the last one. There were 12 of these towers built across the United States. 11 were torn down. This one was left standing, right on top of the sealed ground. And by the time we are done, I think you will find that as strange as I do. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Thanks. The place is called Camp Hero. It sits at Montauk Point in the town of Montauk, at the far end of the South Fork of Long Island in New York State. If you have never been out there, I want you to understand how far the edge of the world it feels. You drive east on the Montauk Highway, and the houses thin out and the trees close in, and the road keeps going long after you think it should have ended. And then there is the lighthouse, and the open ocean, and the wind coming off the water, with nothing between you and Portugal. It is beautiful. It is also, and I mean this in the plainest possible way, a place that was chosen specifically because it was the last good ground before an enemy could reach the city. Everything that was ever built out there was built because someone in a uniform looked at a map and decided this was where the country had to be defended, and the men who built it understood from the very first day that the way to defend it was to make sure no one could tell what they were looking at. I want to start with that because it sets the tone for everything that follows. Camp Hero was a lie before it was anything else. It was commissioned by the United States Army in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, as a coastal defense station. Its job was to guard the approaches to New York Harbor against German ships and German submarines, the U-boats that were, at that point in the war, sinking vessels within sight of American beaches. To do that job, the Army installed enormous guns, 2 batteries of 16-inch coastal artillery, each gun capable of throwing a shell weighing over a ton more than 20 miles out to sea, and a 3rd battery of smaller 6-inch guns. These were not small emplacements. These were the largest guns the country put on its own shoreline. And the Army knew that if a German reconnaissance plane flew over Montauk and photographed a fortress bristling with 16-inch artillery, the enemy would know exactly what was there and exactly how to avoid it or attack it. And I want to pause on why those guns were there at all, because the threat they were built to answer is something most people have quietly forgotten, and it makes the paranoia of the place feel a lot less paranoid. In the first months after the United States entered the war, German submarines came to the American coast and hunted in the shipping lanes right off the beaches. They sank tankers and freighters within sight of land, sometimes close enough that people standing on the shore could see the fires on the water at night. The eastern seaboard was, for a brutal stretch, a shooting gallery, and the eastern tip of Long Island was the doorstep to the most important harbour in the country. The men who fortified Montauk were not inventing a danger to justify a budget. The danger was real, it was offshore, and it was killing people. So when they built the biggest guns in the country into that hillside, they did it with the absolute conviction of men who believed the enemy could arrive any night. And that conviction is exactly why they were willing to go to such lengths to hide what they had built. So they hid it, not with camouflage netting, not with a coat of paint. They built an entire fake town. From the air and from the water, Camp Hero was designed to look like a sleepy little seaside fishing village. The gymnasium was built to resemble a church, complete with what looked from a distance like a steeple. The other buildings were dressed up as a small civilian downtown, a commissary made to look like an ordinary shop, a mess hall, a bowling alley, barracks disguised as houses. The gun batteries themselves were sunk into the hillsides and covered over so that the muzzles emerged through what appeared to be innocent folds in the landscape. A pilot passing overhead would see a quaint little hamlet of a few hundred people, the kind of place that dotted the entire Atlantic coast, and he would fly on. He would have no idea that the church could not hold a single worshipper, that the houses were full of soldiers, and that the hillside below him could put a shell through the deck of a battleship. I find that detail genuinely chilling, and I want to be careful here, because I have made videos before where I leaned too hard on a feeling and not enough on the record, and you all rightly called me on it. So let me be precise. The fake fishing village is not a legend. It is not something a conspiracy author invented in a paperback. It is in the official history of the installation, documented by the Army, documented by the New York State Office of Parks, which now manages the land. You can read the chronological summary they produced, which covers the years 1942 to 1984. You can see the battery diagrams. This happened. The United States built a counterfeit town on the edge of the country and filled it with the biggest guns it had, and it told no one. That is the foundation this entire story is built on, and I want you to hold onto it. Because the question that haunts Camp Hero is not whether the government would hide something out there. We already know the answer to that. They built the whole place to be hidden. The only question that was ever really open is how long they kept doing it and what they were hiding by the end. Now, the conventional history of Camp Hero is not mysterious at all, and I owe it to you to lay it out honestly before I start pulling at the threads. The guns never fired at an enemy. No German fleet ever came. The war ended, and in 1947, the Army deactivated the coastal defense mission and pulled out the 16-inch guns, because the age of battleships shelling coastlines was already passing. For a few years, the site sat quiet, and then the Cold War arrived, and the country looked at its map again and decided that the same piece of ground that had been chosen to watch for German ships was now perfectly placed to watch for something far worse. In 1951, the property was transferred to the Air Force. The guns were gone. In their place came radar. The base was renamed the Montauk Air Force Station, and it became part of the air defense network that ringed the United States during the Cold War, the chain of radar stations and interceptor bases, whose entire job was to give the country a few minutes of warning before Soviet bombers came over the horizon. And in the late 1950s, the Air Force installed the structure that still stands out there today, the one you can see from the lighthouse, the AN/F PS-35. It was a long-range search radar, part of the semi-automatic ground environment system, the network that fed radar data into early computers so that the Air Force could track incoming aircraft across the whole northeastern seaboard. From Montauk Point, that dish could reach hundreds of miles out over the Atlantic. The idea was that if Soviet bombers ever came for New York, this tower would see them first, and the country would get something on the order of half an hour of warning. 30 minutes. That was the margin between an ordinary evening and the end of the world, and it ran through a steel dish on a hill in Montauk. I want to give you a sense of the machine that dish was plugged into, because the scale of it tells you something about how seriously the country took this. The semi-automatic ground environment was one of the largest and most expensive defense systems the United States had ever built. A continent-spanning web of radar stations feeding their signals into some of the first room-sized computers ever made, housed in windowless concrete blockhouses built to keep operating through the opening minutes of a nuclear attack. The whole point was speed. A radar like the one at Montauk would catch a contact far out over the water, and instead of a man squinting at a scope and picking up a telephone, the data would flow into the computer, which would track it, identify it, and if necessary, hand a fighter squadron the intercept. Montauk was an eye on the easternmost edge of that system, one of the first places the country would have seen the thing it was praying never to see. And the men who sat in that blockhouse, turning that dish, were doing one of the strangest jobs in human history. They were paid to stare at an empty sky and wait, every single shift, for the sky to stop being empty. There is a detail about that radar that I think about a lot, and it comes from the people who actually lived out there, not from any researcher or author. For most of 2 decades, from the early 1960s until the end of the 1970s, that dish turned day and night, and every 15 seconds as it swept around, it put a sound into the local radios, a buzz, a little electronic pulse every 15 seconds that you could hear in your kitchen, in your car, in the background of your life, if you lived anywhere near the point. And there is a whole generation of people who grew up in Montauk who told the same thing to anyone who asked. They learned not to hear it. It became the heartbeat of the place, so constant and so regular that the brain edited it out. The way you stop hearing a clock in a room you have lived in for years. Most of them had no idea what it really was. They knew it came from the big dish out by the point. They did not know that the small sound in their radios was the country listening for its own annihilation. And then, around the end of the 1970s, the buzz stopped, and the people who had stopped hearing it suddenly heard the silence. There are photographs of the inside of that base in its last working year, taken in 1980 by a man who spent 35 years out there as the station's boiler fireman, the person who kept the heat running in those concrete buildings through the Long Island winters. They are quiet, ordinary pictures. The radome, the great white sphere that once covered part of the equipment, the tower against a flat grey sky, the everyday machinery of a place that was, to the men who worked it, simply a job, a shift, a paycheck, a long drive out to the end of the island and back. And I think that is worth holding on to alongside everything else, because it is easy, with a story like this, to forget that real people spent their careers out there and went home to dinner. Whatever was or was not happening in the sealed levels, there were also men who just kept the boilers lit. The base closed in 1981, near the end of that man's long career, and his photographs are some of the last ordinary images of the place before the gates were chained and the legend swallowed it whole. Because the mission was ending. By 1980, the AN/FPS-35 had been powered down. The kind of radar it represented was already obsolete, made redundant by newer systems and by the simple, terrible fact that intercontinental ballistic missiles do not give you 30 minutes and do not come in low over the water, where a coastal dish can see them. The strategic logic that had justified Montauk for 30 years had quietly evaporated. The radar squadron that ran the place ceased its operations, and in 1981, the base closed. That is the year the gates were locked. The land sat in limbo for a few years after that, deemed too ecologically valuable to develop, and eventually it passed into the hands of New York State. It would not open to the public as Camp Hero State Park until 2002, and that, according to the official record, is the whole story. A fake village that became a radar base that became a park. Guns that never fired, watching for ships that never came, replaced by a dish that watched for bombers that never came, replaced in the end by hiking trails and a parking lot and signs telling you not to climb on the ruins. That is the explanation. And for most people, for most of the millions who have walked those trails, it is enough. I am not going to stand here and tell you it is a cover story, because I do not know that, and I am not in the business of telling you things I do not know. But I am going to point at the places where that tidy explanation does not quite close, where the official account has edges that do not line up, and I am going to let you sit with them. Because here is the first one, and it is the one that started me down this whole road. If Camp Hero was just an obsolete radar base, just an old pile of Cold War concrete with no further use, then the ordinary thing to do, the cheap thing, the thing the government does with hundreds of decommissioned sites, is to knock it down. Demolish the structures, fill the holes, grade it flat, walk away. That is standard. That is what happens to old bases all over the country. That is not what happened at Montauk. The tunnels and the lower levels beneath the base were not demolished. They were sealed. The doors were welded. The passages were filled with poured concrete. There is a difference between those two things that I think most people slide right past, and I want to stop on it, because it is the whole hinge of this story. When you demolish something, you are saying it has no value, and you want it gone. When you seal something, you are saying something different. You are saying, this stays where it is, but no one gets in. You do not pour concrete into a tunnel you are throwing away. You pour concrete into a tunnel you are closing. And the question that follows from that, the question nobody in any official capacity has ever answered, is the simplest one in the world. Closing it on what? Now I have to be careful again, and I am going to be, because this is exactly the kind of place where a story like this can fall off a cliff. There is a layer to Camp Hero that goes far beyond sealed tunnels, and if you have heard of this place at all, it is probably because of that layer. It is the reason a hit television show exists. It is the reason this base has a name that conspiracy researchers say in a hushed voice, and I am going to walk right up to it with you. but I am going to be honest about what is documented and what is not. Because the difference matters, and because frankly, the documented part is unsettling enough that I do not need to dress it up. The people who explore Camp Hero, the urban explorers, and the abandoned places photographers who've been slipping past the fences for decades, come back with the same kinds of reports. Sealed steel doors, welded shut, set into concrete. Stairwells that descend a flight or two and then stop dead at a wall of poured cement. Ventilation shafts that seem to go down far deeper than a radar station, even a big one, would ever need. The deepest spaces anyone has been able to reach are old fire control rooms that are now partly flooded with seawater, dark and cold and ankle deep, and beyond them, the way is closed. One explorer described finding a tunnel that ended at a heavy door, with a heavy wheel set into the center of it, the kind of mechanism you see on a bank vault or a ship's bulkhead, not the kind of thing you put on a storage closet. Others describe rooms with strange, almost psychedelic, patterned wallpaper, wildly out of place in a military installation, peeling off concrete walls, and in one of the sealed batteries scratched into the concrete by some hand at some point that no one can date. There are 3 words that I have not been able to shake since I first read them. Stranger, help, me. If you walk the place today, and thousands of people do, the geography of it stays with you. You come in off the Montauk highway, past the old road they named Rough Riders Road, after Theodore Roosevelt's cavalry, who were quarantined out on this point after the Spanish-American War, because even a century before the radar, this was already the place the country sent things it wanted kept at the edge. You pass through forest and wetland, and then the trees open, and the batteries are there. Enormous slabs of poured concrete receding into the hillsides, vines crawling up the faces of them, the gun openings staring out at an ocean they never fired on. The barracks and the fake downtown stand rotting in the salt air, the church that was never a church, the bowling alley, the mess hall, all of it boarded and chained. And everywhere the signs, do not enter, do not climb, danger, chain link fence topped with barbed wire wrapped around structure after structure. The surface of Camp Hero tells you 2 things at once, and it tells you both of them the moment you arrive. Something important happened here, and you are not allowed to know what it was. I want to tell you exactly what that is and what it is not. That graffiti is real. People have photographed it. It exists on the wall of a sealed structure at Camp Hero. What I cannot tell you is who wrote it, or when, or why, or what they meant. It could be a frightened teenager who snuck in on a dare in 1995 and got turned around in the dark and scrawled it as a half-joke that stopped being funny. It could be older. It could be nothing. I genuinely do not know, and anyone who tells you they do know is selling you something. But I will say this. There is a particular kind of cold that comes over you when you read words like that on a wall in a place that the government sealed with concrete and refuses to discuss. And that cold is the entire reason I make these videos. It is the feeling that you have walked up to the edge of something and the something is not answering. Here is where the famous layer comes in. And here is where I am going to hand the microphone to other people, because these are not my claims and I will not present them as fact. Starting in the early 1990s, a man named Preston Nichols published a book called The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. And in that book, and in the ones that followed it, Nichols laid out a set of claims about Camp Hero that are, to put it mildly, enormous. He claimed that the base did not really close when the records say it did. He claimed that beneath that radar tower, in those sealed underground levels, the government ran a secret program of experiments that went far past anything in the official files: mind control, psychological warfare. According to the accounts that grew up around Nichols, there was something called the Montauk chair, a device that supposedly amplified the abilities of psychic subjects. There were claims of experiments on people, including, in the darkest versions of the story, children taken off the streets. And in the most extreme version of all, the version that inspired a generation of fiction, there were claims of tears opened in time itself, of doorways punched through into other places and other years. I am going to say plainly what I think about those specific claims, and then I am going to be just as plain about the part that I cannot dismiss. The grand version of the Montauk project, the time travel and the chair and the rest of it, rests almost entirely on the testimony of a small number of people, recovered in some cases through hypnosis, which is a method that produces vivid memories and unreliable ones in roughly equal measure. There is no document I have ever seen that confirms any of it, and when researchers and ordinary citizens have done the responsible thing and filed Freedom of Information Act requests, asking the government for anything referencing the projects by name, asking for construction plans and funding trails and duty rosters and anything at all about classified work under that tower, the answers have come back the same way every time. No matching records, no hidden budget, no secret laboratories in the files. The agencies released what they had, which was radar staffing paperwork and environmental cleanup reports and closure summaries, and none of it describes the thing the legend describes. State surveys of the park have not turned up secret underground complexes. So if you are asking me, did the government run a time travel mind control program for kidnapped children under Montauk? My honest answer is that the evidence for that specific story is not there, and that an extraordinary claim with no documents behind it is a story, not a fact. But, and this is the but that keeps me up, and it is the reason I could not just leave this one alone. The very same FOIA process that found no time machine also found something else, something quieter, and, to me, far harder to wave away. The records from Camp Hero are incomplete, not in the dramatic way the legend wants, in a bureaucratic way, which is somehow worse, because bureaucracy does not usually leave gaps by accident. There are documents that come back redacted. There are requests that draw exemptions, the formal legal stamps that mean we have this, and you cannot see it. There are stretches of the site's later life where the paper trail simply thins out and does not fully account for what the place was doing. And no FOIA response has ever explained why. So you are left with this strange shape. The wildest version of the story has no evidence, and the official version has holes in it that the official version will not fill. The truth, whatever it is living somewhere in that gap, and the tunnels where the answer would be are full of concrete. I want to be specific about what those requests actually asked for, because the specificity is part of what makes the silence interesting. People did not just write to the government and ask vaguely, is there anything weird at Montauk? They asked for everything a real program leaves behind: construction plans, funding records, duty rosters listing who was stationed there and when, equipment manifests, any document that referenced the project names that float through the legend. And the responses that came back released the mundane and ordinary, the staffing paperwork and the cleanup reports, while the fuller picture of the site's later years stayed thin and, in places, formally withheld. Now, I have to be fair, and you know I will be. There is a perfectly ordinary explanation for incomplete Cold War records. Files get lost, things get misfiled, destroyed on a routine schedule, transferred between agencies, and never reassembled. bureaucracies are not careful the way a conspiracy needs them to be careful. But it is also true that during the decades in question, the American defense budget contained enormous sums of money that were never publicly accounted for. Billions of dollars in so-called black programs, hidden under innocuous names and shielded from ordinary oversight. That is not speculation either. The same accounting practices that concealed stealth aircraft and spy satellites until long after the fact were standard tools of the era. So when I look at a record with a hole in it, I genuinely do not know whether I am looking at the ordinary carelessness of bureaucracy or the deliberate quiet of something that was funded to never appear in the files at all. And I cannot tell which. That is the honest center of this whole story. I cannot tell which. Let me put the two halves of this side by side, because I think when you hold them together, you feel the real weight of it. On one side, you have a place with a documented, proven history of deception. A base built as a fake village. A mission so secret that the locals could not have told you what the buzzing in their radios meant. A government that has demonstrated beyond any argument that it was willing to put an entire counterfeit town on the map to hide what was really at Montauk Point. On the other side, you have an ending that does not behave like an ordinary ending. Tunnels sealed instead of demolished, doors welded shut, a vault wheel at the end of a passage, 3 words scratched into the concrete, a radar tower left standing alone when its 11 brothers were scrapped, and a public record that, when you press on it, has a soft spot it will not let you reach. I am not connecting those two halves for you. I am setting them next to each other, and I am telling you that I cannot make them sit comfortably apart. There is a question I keep circling, and I have not been able to answer it, so I am going to give it to you the way it lives in my own head. Why is the tower still there? Think about it. The AN/F PS-35 at Montauk is, by most accounts, the last fully intact example of its kind left in the country. 11 others, the same model, the same role, were taken down, salvaged, scrapped. They were valuable as scrap steel, and they were liabilities as structures, and the government had every ordinary reason to remove them, and it did remove them everywhere else. But not at Montauk. At Montauk, the dish still turns slowly in the wind, pointing at nothing, rusting in the salt air. And over the decades, there have been efforts to tear it down and efforts to preserve it, and it has simply, stubbornly, remained. Now there is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Local people fought to keep it as a landmark. It became a piece of Cold War history worth saving. That is probably the answer. But I will admit that some part of me, the part that has read too many sealed record stories, looks at that lonely tower and wonders whether it is harder to dismantle a structure when you have poured concrete into everything beneath its feet. And here is the thing that turns this from a strange local story into something that I think actually matters. The thing that made me want to give it a full episode rather than a passing mention. Camp Hero was not unique. It was one node in a vast machine. During the Cold War, the United States built a continental web of these places, a chain of radar stations and missile sites and interceptor bases that ran along the coasts and across the northern border, a system that defense people sometimes called the Ring of Supersonic Steel. There were Nike missile bases tucked into suburbs and hilltops, ready to fire at incoming bombers. There were radar stations like Montauk strung out along the shorelines. There were command bunkers and control centers and listening posts, hundreds of installations, all built in a hurry, all built in secret, all built for a war that, thank God, never came. And when the strategy that justified them evaporated, when the bombers were replaced by missiles and the whole architecture became obsolete almost overnight. The country was left holding hundreds of these sites. Most were abandoned, many were demolished, some were quietly sealed, and almost none of them were ever fully explained to the public that paid for them and lived beside them. Think about the Nike missile bases for a second, because they make the point better than I can. At the height of the Cold War, there were Nike sites ringing every major American city, surface-to-air missiles buried in launch pits, in the middle of ordinary suburbs, in parks, on farmland, sometimes within a few hundred yards of family homes, and the families nearby often had no real idea what was sitting under the grass at the end of their road. Those sites were everywhere, and then, when the strategy changed, they were nowhere. Decommissioned in waves. Some were sold off. Some were handed to local governments. Some were simply sealed and left. There are people in this country mowing lawns and walking dogs on top of launch pits that once held missiles tipped with warheads, and most of them will never know it. That is the world Camp Hero belonged to. A whole secret geography laid down across the country in a panic, and then abandoned just as fast and never accounted for. Montauk is just the one with the tower you can still see. The one too dramatic to disappear quietly. The one that got a book and a television show. For every Montauk, there are dozens of sites that got no book and no show and no curious visitors. That just got the concrete and the chain link and the silence. So the question stops being about one tower on one point of land. The question becomes much larger and much colder. How many camp heroes are there? How many places like this are scattered across the country, sitting in plain sight, fenced off, sealed up, sitting under the picnic tables and the hiking trails of parks that families visit on weekends, without the faintest idea of what is welded shut beneath their feet? Who decided which of those places would be opened and studied, and which would be filled with concrete and forgotten? And who decided what we, the people on the surface, would be allowed to know about any of it? Because the lesson of Montauk, the one thing in this entire story that I can state without any hedging at all, is that the government built that place specifically so that the people living right next to it could not tell what it was. That is not a theory. That is the founding fact. And once you know a place was designed from the ground up to deceive the people standing closest to it, it becomes very, very hard to take the rest of the official story entirely on faith. I have stood at the edge of this kind of thing before, on this channel, and you all know my position by now. I do not need the wildest version of a story to be true for the story to mean something. I do not need a time machine under Montauk. The documented version is enough. A counterfeit town, a radar that listened for the end of the world and put a heartbeat into the local radios, a mission that ended in welded doors and poured concrete instead of bulldozers, a record with a hole in it that the people who keep the record will not let you reach, and one lonely tower, the last of its kind, still turning over a sealed darkness that no one will open and no one will explain. You do not have to believe a single word Preston Nichols ever wrote to find that unsettling. You only have to look at what is actually provably there and ask the question that the concrete was poured to prevent you from asking. So I will leave you where I started, standing on the bluff at the end of Long Island, looking up at that dish. It is still there as you watch this. You could drive out tomorrow and see it for yourself, and a lot of you will. And if you do, walk down to where the old batteries recede into the hillsides. Find the doors that do not open and put your hand on the concrete. It is cold, even in summer. Somewhere below it are passages that the United States government decided, at the end of all this, were better filled than emptied. They did not tell us why. They have never told us why. And the tower keeps turning, slowly, pointing at an empty sky, the last sentinel of a war that never arrived, standing watch over whatever it is they sealed beneath it. I do not know what is down there. I want to be honest with you about that until the very last second of this video. I do not know, but I know they closed it on purpose, and I know that some doors are welded shut, not because there is nothing behind them, but because there is. If you made it all the way to the end, comment the word sealed below, so I know who stayed with me through the whole thing. Make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And let me know in the comments what other places like this you want me to look into. Because I promise you, Montauk is not the only door of its kind in this country. You enjoyed watching this one. I promise you this one will keep you at the edge of your seat.